So I didn't plan on telling this story, but it just kind of came to me. I was thinking about my own mother. And I remember the last Sunday that I spent in the church I grew up in, which was a tad more conservative than the one I'm standing in now. And I'd gone away to college. I was in Morgantown, West Virginia, going to West Virginia University. I grew up in Vienna, West Virginia, which is a little town on the Ohio River. And I come back home for Mother's Day. And so, because Mom always went to church, I went to church with her. And they had a new minister. He was not the guy that I'd grown up with, and then not the guy that had been there. Like, we got a new preacher when I was maybe in junior high school. And Reverend Hadley had left, and they had this new guy. So, we get through the first part of it, the singing the hymns I always enjoyed doing, and got settled in for, a long winter's nap, the sermon. And he started preaching about an Old Testament, I don't remember the actual verse anymore, but it was a story about adultery. And I was like, what? You're doing what on Mother's Day? And I said, that's the last time I'm setting foot in that church. And until just a few years ago, I was back visiting my hometown. It wasn't Sunday. I just, wanted to kind of see what they were doing. And I popped in to say hello. And it's like, yeah, this guy that was self-identifying as agnostic in Baptist Youth Fellowship, he preaches down in Birmingham, Alabama now. So, and yeah. And one of the, they've gotten so big now, they have like associate ministers, which we didn't have when I was growing up. And one of those guys gave me, the cook's tour of the church. And it was nice. It was healing. But I'm not going to be talking about any of that stuff today. As we honor those women who are our mothers and those mother figures in our lives, and they can come from a lot of different directions. It could be a step parent, a foster parent, a friend's mom that we spend a lot of time at. I was growing up, there were a few people who called my mom, just because of the way we kind of ran our household. And, teachers that have really touched us and gone over and above the call emotionally. But there are a lot of other mothers out there in the world, and they're not just mothering to us emotionally with compassion and devotion, but they are creating larger things. They are literally changing the world by being the mother of, you name it. And there are several people that, I could spend the rest of the service just naming names, but just a couple of the folks who came to mind as I was preparing this. Harriet Tubman, it's kind of, you could call her the mother of abolition or the mother of freedom, and I'll talk a little bit more about Harriet. But there were a lot of people who'd been slaves that became free because of what she did. Elizabeth Blackwell, who was the first female doctor in the United States. She was the first woman to get her MD, and she kind of paved the way for a lot of other women. She helped other women to become MDs as well. Ellen Johnson Sirleaf, who was elected president of Liberia in 2006. She was the first elected female head of state on the African continent. Malala Yousafzai, who is, I think she's 21 this year, but you could call her the mother of education for women in her country, and I'll talk a little bit more about her as well. Wangari Maathai, who was a Kenyan scientist, professor, and an environmental and political activist. And she founded the Green Belt movement, and in 2004 was the first African woman to be awarded the Nobel Prize. Benazir Bhutto, who was the first woman elected to be the democratically elected head of a Muslim nation. So many women who are changing the world with some of those same qualities that we think of when we think of a mother. We look at a mother bear, or just all those maternal things. And when I ask myself, it's like, okay, so what common qualities do these amazing women who have given birth, not just to people, but to some of the great institutions that we have, to movements. They've gone out and fought for justice, and in some cases died for it. What do they share? And the three things that initially came to my mind were courage and a willingness to sacrifice and creative power. It seems that pretty much every mother has those in some degree or another, but some of these truly amazing women demonstrate those just in spades. So as I was thinking about them, I thought, okay, so who really to me exemplifies courage? And I thought of Harriet Tubman, who, if you're not familiar with Harriet, she was born in slavery, and she escaped from Maryland, where she had been held as a slave, into Pennsylvania, which was at the time a free state, the slave state, free state. And she lived there for a little while, but the idea that there were still some of her brothers and sisters and other relatives and friends that were being held captive got to bothering her. And she became one of the conductors on the Underground Railroad. And over the course of somewhere between 17 and 19 missions back into, the slave states, which could have gotten her captured and sent back into captivity, she freed, and it's estimated somewhere around 70 people. That takes a lot of courage in and of itself. But something that I did not know about her as I started digging into her life was that when the Civil War broke out, she and some of the other folks that had been involved in the Underground Railroad followed the Union troops as they headed into the South. And what they did was they would follow behind the front lines, find those slaves that had been freed, or had somehow made it to the Union lines, and then they would make sure they were safe and help them flow back to the north. So as I got to South Carolina, she became a little more than, that. She also got into becoming a scout. She kind of got familiar with the lay of the land, and then she started spying. And then finally, she became so involved with their operations that she helped lead an operation, and I want to get the name of the place right. It was the Combahee Ferry Raid that she helped lead. So she's already scouted the area out. She helps lead the Union troops down the Combahee River, which was mined. And then when they got to the landing, she and some of her compatriots got out and went off to free slaves while the Union soldiers were fighting the Confederates. They freed over 700 slaves during that operation, even though they were under artillery fire and being shot at by the Confederate soldiers. It was so successful that she was asked to do that again several times throughout the war, and ended up helping especially the Massachusetts 54th Infantry, which was a famous black regiment in the Confederate, or in the Union Army. She managed to do all these extremely extraordinary feats, even though most historians say she didn't stand 5 feet tall. And she suffered her entire life from what we would today classify as a traumatic brain injury. When she was 15 years old, she had been loaned out to a nearby plantation, and one of the overseers there was trying to capture another slave, and he asked her to help him. When she refused, he threw a 2-pound piece of iron that hit her in the head, and she didn't receive much in the way of treatment. And her entire life she suffered from headaches and dizziness and what we would today call epileptic seizures. She was an extraordinarily courageous woman, and you'll get to see a lot more of Harriet because she's been chosen by the U.S. Treasury Department to adorn our new $20 bills instead of Andrew Jackson, which is awesome. All right? So when I think of sacrifice, and not to say that that this young woman's not courageous, because she is. But I thought of Malala Yousafzai, and most of us have heard of Malala. If you've been on the internet at all in the past several years, you're bound to have run across her. She is an activist for education from Pakistan. She was born in when I read these dates and her ages, it just boggles my mind. She was born in 1997, and where she lived at the time she was born there was still kind of a tourist destination. It was before the Taliban had taken over. But as she grew older, the Taliban began exerting their influence more and more. And by the time she was 11 years old, they were trying to prevent girls from being educated. Her father actually ran a school that she attended. And at the age of 11, she gave a talk in Peshawar entitled, "How Dare the Taliban Take Away My Basic Right to Education?" It's an 11-year-old. Then when she was 12, she started blogging for the BBC under an assumed name. But later, her 12th year, her identity was revealed, and the Taliban began making death threats, which her family didn't really take seriously, because they're like, nobody's going to kill a 12-year-old child. They waited until she was 15 to try to kill her. And when she was 15 years old, she was riding a bus, and it was stopped by the Taliban, and a gunman boarded the bus and said, which one of you is Malala Yousafzai? And a bunch of people looked at her, and so he started shooting, and he shot her in the head. One of the bullets went on down into her neck. He actually injured a couple other girls as well. But she was evacuated to one of the military hospitals, and they had to remove part of her skull to relieve the pressure on her brain. She was flown to the other Birmingham in England, and they did a bunch of operations on her there. 9 months later, she's 16 years old. In fact, it was her 16th birthday she addressed the United Nations. And among the things that she said were that following the attack, the terrorists thought that they would change our aims and stop our ambitions. But nothing changed in my life except this. Weakness, fear, and hopelessness died. Strength, power, and courage were born. That's a 16-year-old. So I have another person of about that age who's going to share with us a little bit more about Malala. It's my stepdaughter, Abby. Abby is a student in the creative writing program at ASFA, and she just recently got the third place prize in the International Youth Writing Contest sponsored by Columbia University, which annually receives tens of thousands of entries. So we are in for a treat. So Abby, you want to come on up and share with us? Thanks.
Hi. This is my poem called Malala. Sing to me of Pakistan, of the beautiful, proud, golden statue of Buddha perched over Swat. Whisper in the darkness of the tenderness of my mother's arms and the boom of my father's voice. Look up at the moon and stars and tell me of the nights when they would watch over me as I slept. You say when I pin away my hair and wrap my head, the ghost of Benazir floats in the mirror. I do not see Benazir. I see myself. I see a scared girl. I see blood dripping down my face. I recall how the bullet went into my head. Do not speak to me of how the beautiful Buddha got torn down. Do not speak to me of how my mother's fingers are calloused and how my father's voice is soft. In the darkest of hours, when all hope seems lost, when the words you say tumble out of your mouth covered in blood, when the only thing you can see is death and destruction, and you cannot sing to me of Pakistan. Instead, sing to me of its girls.
Thanks, Abby. Thank you. So the reason that I thought of that girl, that woman, when I think of sacrifice, that young woman sacrificed her childhood. And she very nearly sacrificed her life. And in some ways, she even sacrificed her country. After being evacuated to England, she did not return to Pakistan until a little earlier this year. So to give up one's homeland and to give up one's childhood and to nearly give up one's life in the cause of freedom of mind, freedom of expression, the freedom to learn things that so many of us take for granted. She's something. When I searched around for someone that represented creative power to me, there are a lot of women that I could have chosen, and maybe some that might be more of the earth-shattering, world-changing types. But the person that I chose to talk about is the woman we call Grandma Moses, the painter. And there were a couple of reasons for that. Now, if you don't know much about her, she was born Anna Mary Robertson, about 100 years before I was born, in 1860. And she lived what would appear to be a very normal life for a woman of that time. She was one of 10 children, and at the age of 12, she went to work as a hired hand on a neighboring farm, and apparently worked as a child laborer and then a young woman laborer until she was about 27, and got married to a fellow named Moses. And they ended up moving from New York, where she was born, down to the Shenandoah Valley in Virginia, where they farmed and lived a very simple life, like the life depicted in her paintings. She raised 5 children past childhood. She actually gave birth to 10. 5 of them died in infancy, which was probably not uncommon for those days. I mean, just for that, we can honor her on Mother's Day. But it's her creative power and the way that she went about it that I wanted to honor. The very first time she painted something, she was my age. She was 58 years old. It was 1918. And she painted a fireboard in her house. She still did not paint regularly for many years after that. When she was 67 years old, her husband of 40 years passed, and she went into deep grief, and she was looking for things to do with her time, so she started painting a little more regularly. And by the time she was in her 70s, she was painting a lot of the time. But it wasn't until she was 78 years old that a fella came through town, and she'd been showing some of her paintings at one of the little local stores. He bought everything she had and took it back to New York. And shortly after that, her paintings were shown in New York for the first time, and the rather prolific artist that we think of as Grandma Moses kind of got her start at nearly 80 years old. Aside from the fact that she was of a certain age when she began really expressing her creative power, one of the other things that really speaks to me is she was completely untrained. She's referred to as a rustic artist because she never had any kind of formal art education. She just painted. And as I was reading about her, I read the way that she described her creative process. And she said that, essentially it was, she would get an idea, something would come to her, and she would just start painting it and just go through it and do it, and it just came from her. I think of that idea that no matter what age we are, and no matter whether or not somebody has formally taught us, that we are able to produce extraordinary and beautiful things. I mean, that's almost the epitome of mother energy and that power that our mothers had. It took a lot of courage to become a mother, and Lord knows there's a lot of sacrifice involved, but that creative power that created each and every one of us, when it's harnessed, when we turn it outwards, it's not only something that these extraordinary women can have, but it's something that we can use. When we look at them, I don't have to be a woman to want to be as brave as Harriet Tubman. I don't have to be a woman to want to be willing to sacrifice for a higher purpose the way Malala did. And I certainly don't have to be a woman to say, you know what, I bet I could do that if I tried. I might be able to make something beautiful, no matter how old I am, and whether or not I ever went to class. No matter where I am in my life, I have the innate ability, that divine spark that helps me to create something beautiful and something special. And if I put all of those things together, maybe, just maybe, if I stay at it, if I don't give up when it feels like giving up would be the easier, softer way, maybe I can change the world. So today, as we are honoring our mothers and as we are honoring all those women who have touched us, all those sources that the Daily Word talked about of motherly love that have come to us, we can also honor those ideals that those mothers have lived. And we can all challenge ourselves, whether we are male, female, or we are gender fluid. We can challenge ourselves to change the world like a mother. Please join me in prayer. Sweet Spirit, we are so deeply grateful for all the mothers in our lives, for their love, for their courage, for their sacrifice, and for their creative power, for their ability not only to bring us forth, but their ability to bring forth a better world, one they wanted their children to live in, and their children's children. And as we go forth today, we affirm that we too have that power to change the world and to love, to give of ourselves for that spirit, for that love, for that power. We say thank you. Thank you, God. So it is.